Today we're going to talk a little bit about conflict and communication. Now, I intentionally put this unit right at the end of the semester because it's a very short one, because really all we're going to be doing is adding a little bit of extra terminology that we haven't really touched on earlier in the semester. So we're first going to talk a little bit about what actual conflict is. And at its core, it's basically when two people have differing ideas, thoughts, or needs, and these differences are perceived as incompatible. So one of the things to keep in mind when thinking about what a conflict is and how conflicts function is that in order for a conflict to truly exist, there has to be some sort of care between those two parties. You have to care about the issue. You have to at least somewhat care about the other person. And the reason why there has to be some sort of a relationship or care about the issue or the other parties is because if there wasn't, you just wouldn't argue because you don't care enough. Think about even if you're somebody who, you read lots of crap online. Maybe it's trolls, things that are, people are posting stupid stuff on the internet, and you just don't comment, you don't let it get to you, you don't do anything, because you don't care enough about that person. Sometimes you see this in public, there's somebody who's just really being an idiot, or somebody that maybe you traditionally would have some sort of a conflict with, but you just care so little about that person that it's just not worth the time and the energy. I have had some people in the past ask me about conflict within friend groups, and they'll say things like, well, I don't really ever get into fights with my friends. Does that mean we don't care for each other? Because that doesn't make sense. Well, the way to think about it is there is a difference between fighting and conflict. Conflict is simply the opposing ideas. Fighting is one way that you deal with that conflict, because there's other ways. There's things like compromise. There's the idea that sometimes the conflict isn't enough for you to care about, so instead you're just kind of like, okay, we'll just do what you want to do because it's really not that big of a deal. Or you'll say like, today we're going to do what I want to do, tomorrow we're going to do what you want to do. That's something we're going to get to in a little bit. But remember, fighting is just one way to deal with it. The conflict itself is simply the contrast of ideas, the incompatibility of your thoughts and your needs. So first off, there are two different types of conflicts that exist. Now, there is some, advantages and disadvantages to each of these, but we basically have overt conflicts and covert conflicts. An overt conflict is one where you openly discuss the issue with the other person. You say, this is the problem I have, this is what's been bugging me about you, this is what's been bothering me about the situation, and you're open and honest about it. A covert conflict is one where you internalize the problem and you don't let the other person know that there is a problem there. Now, again, there's advantages and disadvantages to both of these. The advantage to an overt conflict is, of course, that you're able to talk the issue out. And since you're able to talk the issue out, you're going to be able to solve it. The disadvantage of an overt conflict is sometimes there's certain things that just aren't worth bringing up. There are certain things that's just not worth telling the other person you're upset about or that you're bothered about, because maybe there's absolutely nothing they can do about it. Maybe it's such a small thing that you're going to end up nitpicking them. For example, if you're dating somebody, should you tell your significant other that you don't like their mother? That's probably a really bad idea because there's nothing they can do about it. It's their mom. So just shut your mouth. Keep it to yourself. Or something that I've always kind of practiced with my own family is if the thing that's bothering me isn't going to bother me tomorrow, just let it go because it doesn't actually matter. So to look at this in terms of covert conflict, it's really the opposite. The benefits of a covert conflict is that sometimes things just aren't worth talking about. Sometimes things are just worth letting it go because it isn't actually going to do anything. And if you talk about every little thing that bothers you about somebody, you're just going to end up nagging them all of the time. But of course, the bad part of a covert conflict is that you internalize it. And if you internalize something, what tends to happen is that it just builds. Have you ever had a situation where you just are bottling something up and then you end up exploding about something completely different? You're not even upset about the thing you exploded about. You're upset about something totally different, but you've bottled it up. You've internalized it for so long that it ends up just coming out in a really aggressive way. When it comes to conflicts, there's 4 parts of it, or 4 components. We have the conflict of interest, conflict orientation, conflict responses, and conflict outcomes. So we're going to start with the first one, conflict of interest, which is basically the idea of what is the conflict actually about. What is it at its heart? Now, the really important part about this idea of a conflict of interest is to recognize that often people's emotions have multiple layers. What will often happen is people will be upset about something. Maybe they pick a fight about something that's surface level, and it maybe even seems trivial, but the real issue is something much deeper. And the hard part is digging down to that deep issue. What are you actually upset about? I've had this happen in my own life before. I've had problems, this has happened with my sister where I'll be a real bitch about something and I'm really just picking fights or I'm really just upset about something. And even if you deal with that surface level thing, the problem isn't the surface level. It's something much deeper than that. It's that I was jealous about something or I was offended about something or whatever it is. But the problem is a lot of times we don't even really know what that heart is. We don't always recognize what is the actual problem here because you might be patching all of these surface level holes, but if you don't know what the issue is, all that's going to happen is that you're going to keep sinking. You're going to keep going back to that same problem until you deal with what is the actual conflict. Conflict orientation deals with how do you view a conflict. When a conflict comes up, do you view it as an opportunity to argue? Do you view it as an opportunity to show the other person how much you care about them? Do you view it as an opportunity to try to better yourself? Well, all of those are examples of conflict orientations. So the 4 primary ones are competition, compromise, avoidance, and accommodation. Now, the ones you tend to gravitate more towards, how you tend to view conflict, is going to change based on the situation. It's also very much going to change based on who the conflict is with. So the first one we have is competition. Anytime a conflict shows up, you see it as an opportunity to fight. You see it as an opportunity to flex your muscles and make sure that you get what you want. Now, sometimes this conflict is something really big. You truly want your way. You want this job over this other person. You want to get the best deal on a car, whatever it is. But sometimes these are very trivial things. It might be you and your friend are going out and you want to go to one place for dinner and they want to go to another. You want to see one type of movie, they want to see another. That technically is conflict. So if you view it as competition, you're going to view it as I want what I want. We're going to go to dinner where I want to go. We're going to see the movie that I want to see. Compromise is, of course, what we should probably strive to do most of the time, which is when you try to find some sort of a middle ground. Now, that middle ground can be anything. It could be, let's go back to the simple example of dinner and a movie with your friend. It could be something like, well, we're going to see the movie that I want to see, but you can pick where we're going to go to dinner. Or you know what, let's go to a totally different food option that wasn't neither one of our first picks, but it was both of our second picks. That's a good compromise. Or maybe we do what I want to do today and we do what you want to do tomorrow. So compromise, you guys know what it is. It's just a healthy way in most cases to look at conflict. Avoidance is when you do whatever the other person wants just because you want to avoid confrontation. You don't want to deal with it, so you just don't. You let them do what they want because you just don't want to deal with their complaining. Often this will also result in very covert conflicts. Sometimes the other person doesn't even know that that's happening. They don't even know that you're upset or that you're just doing whatever they want because you just don't want to deal with them. But this one tends to be a very unhealthy way to deal with conflict. And accommodation. Accommodation is also when you do what the other person wants, but it's not because you want to avoid the confrontation. It's because you just want them to be happy. You really don't care so much about what you're doing as long as they're happy. This would be something like you go out to a restaurant that you don't really like, but your significant other, your friend, really, really likes it there. And you're like, yeah, as long as you like it, I'm fine. I'll find something that I like. This would be, I think about this with my parents, for example. My mom is a master gardener. She loves flowers. And she drags my dad to flower shows absolutely all the time. And I know he hates them, but he goes because it makes her so happy. That is an example of accommodation. How you tend to view conflict, so your conflict orientation, and what you actually do, how you respond to it, are 2 slightly different things. So there's 4 primary ways that people tend to deal with an actual conflict when it shows up. Most of these I think are a little bit easier to think about when we're actually talking about fighting, when we're actually talking about like a full argument. So kind of imagine a confrontation shows up, an argument shows up. What do you tend to do? Now, even though this, just like everything else, is probably dependent on the situation, it's probably going to change depending on who you're talking to, what you're arguing about. But there is a tendency for people to gravitate more towards one response than another. There's also some, positives and negatives with each of these. So as we go through these, try to think about which one you are. What do you tend to do? First, we have exit responses. So an exit responder is somebody who, when a conflict shows up, when a confrontation shows up, they exit. They exit the conversation. They exit the room. In some cases, they exit the relationship completely. Now, there are some goods and bad to this. The negatives to being an exit responder are pretty obvious. You don't ever solve anything because you just don't deal with it. But positives to being an exit responder, though, would be something like, I, for example, fully acknowledge I tend to be an exit responder. I absolutely hate conflict. I tend to peace out whenever it's going to show up. The positive side of it is that I also have a tendency to, when I get upset about something, to say something I don't actually mean. So an exit response could be something like, I'm going to go leave for a few minutes until I can clear my head. I'm going to get off the phone with you right now. I'm going to stop texting you so I can kind of think about what I actually want to say and I don't end up saying or doing something that I don't mean or that I'm going to regret later. Now, exit responses really are only positive if you come back. If you exit and you never come back, that is obviously going to be a negative. I should also mention that different people in relationships who respond in different ways, any, combination of these will work successfully, but there are some that are slightly more volatile than others. For example, 2 exit responders in a relationship can be somewhat tricky because neither one of you ever want to talk the problems out. If it's small things, if they're trivial things, that's probably fine. You just kind of let it work itself out. But if it's a really big issue and neither one of you wants to deal with it, then that can obviously become very problematic. A neglect responder is one who ignores the problem. They tend to recognize that the problem is there. They just completely ignore it because it's easier. You just don't deal with it. This does tend to lead to a very doormat syndrome type of relationship where you just let the other person walk all over you because you just don't want to deal. Usually people who are very avoidance-based when it comes to their orientation tend to be neglect responders, is they just don't deal with it. They neglect that there's a problem. Sometimes they neglect their own thoughts, their own feelings, and they just pretend that the problem isn't there. Loyalty responders are similar to neglect responders in the sense that they tend to ignore the problem, but the difference is with neglect responders, maybe they notice there's a problem there, maybe they don't, but with a loyalty responder, that person almost always knows that there's a problem, but they don't care. They are so loyal to that relationship. They are so loyal to that other person that they are willing to do anything to make that relationship work. Now, again, the positives and negatives to these two are really kind of dependent on how you view things. It really kind of depends on the situation. So it really kind of also depends on how extreme you are with these responses. The negative on both of these is pretty obvious. You let yourself get walked all over. You don't ever get your way and you tend to not ever deal with things. The positive, especially in a loyalty response though, is that sometimes things get hard. Relationships are difficult. Problems are going to arise. No matter how much you love the other person, no matter how much you guys care about each other, you're going to have a rough patch. Things are going to get rocky sometimes. And without that loyalty response there, or even in some cases a neglect response, again, this one is more if it's a small issue and you just don't worry about it. But without that response, it's a lot easier to give up. Sometimes you have to tough out a relationship to get to the good again. Now, obviously, some relationships shouldn't ever continue on, but a lot of them should, just recognizing that there are going to be rough patches. So being loyal to that other person, being loyal to that relationship, definitely can have some benefits. And a voice responder is exactly what it sounds like. This is somebody who's going to talk the issue out. Just like overt and covert conflicts, it has the exact same advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is you get to talk things out. The disadvantage is sometimes you can come off as very naggy. Again, any combination of people and responses can work together. Any combination can also not work together. It just kind of depends on you. It just kind of depends on your partner. And it kind of depends on how extreme you feel with each of these. And lastly, we have the conflict outcomes. Now, the base level of this is who won the argument, who got their way. But that's only part of it. And I'd argue that that's the less important part of the two. The really important part of your conflict outcomes is what did you learn during the process of this conflict? For example, there might be a situation where you got your way. You won the argument. You won the fight. But in doing so, you learned that you don't really care about that person. You were willing to say the things that you shouldn't say. Or maybe there was a time where you lost the argument. You didn't get your way. But in doing so, you realize that that other person really does care about your thoughts and feelings and that you're able to have a disagreement. You're able to argue, you're able to fight and come out stronger on the other side. I've heard people have often said that a successful relationship needs to have a pretty big fight early on so that you learn how the other person fights. And I kind of agree with that. I think it is important to know how you and the other person are going to work through your conflicts because it's something that's going to come up. And knowing how that other person argues, knowing how you argue, knowing if you're going to take the high road or if they're going to take the low road, that's really important to know in a relationship. And that's a big part of your conflict outcomes. And with that, we are wrapping up the lectures for this class. The biggest thing that I hope you got from all of this material, because I recognize that you're not going to remember most of these terms, that's totally fine. You're not going to remember, the different, specific theories or themes. That's totally fine. What I hope you took from it was just an understanding of how complex communication is, and most importantly, an awareness of how you communicate, how you interact with others, how much of an impact communication does have on your self-concept, how you view others, how you work with others, how it's going to, impact your relationships. Because I would argue that's the most important part of all school, is it's not necessarily what is it you're learning, it's more about how are you thinking. It's all about learning to think, to be analytical, to be aware of the world that's going on around you.